which brings us to the quality of Baltimore schools, urban Baltimore schools, where research by my next guest determined that there are at least 13 public schools in Baltimore, all of whom located in the inner city, where 0% of the kids can do math at grade level. My guest is the lead investigative reporter for Project Baltimore, Fox 45's ongoing investigation into Maryland's public education system. He's an award-winning reporter and best-selling author. His book is called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. Please welcome to the program, Chris Papst.
Thank you for having me on. I appreciate it.
Chris, my pleasure. Is it Pabst, like Pabst Blue Ribbon beer?
Almost. It's
Almost.
P-A-P-S-T.
Pabst.
There's no B.
Pabst?
Yes.
Okay.
Pabst.
Chris, thank you so much for coming on. 13 public schools in Baltimore, all located in the inner city. Chris, 0% can do math at grade level. Are you kidding me?
This is common. So that story that you're talking about, Project Baltimore produced, I believe it was 2 years ago, using 2023 data. And what we had found was there were 13 high schools in Baltimore City that did not have any students proficient in math. And that came out to being 40% of all the high schools in Baltimore City did not have one student who tested proficient in math. Now, earlier this year, when President Donald Trump, when he signed the executive order to dismantle the Department of Education, he mentioned one school system. He mentioned Baltimore, and he mentioned that stat that we just talked about, that 40% of the high schools in this city did not have a single student who could score proficient in math. It is stunning. It is not uncommon. In fact, it's quite common. A few years before that, Larry, we did a story, Project Baltimore did, on 6 schools in the city that did not have a student proficient in anything, math, English, or science. 6 entire schools, hundreds of kids. Not one of them was proficient on any state test. That is the current situation in Baltimore. And by the way, a school system that gets $1.7 billion a year, and those are some of the results.
Chris, I've been talking about urban school systems in LA, in Detroit, in Newark, in Philadelphia, but it seems to me Baltimore might even be worse. Is that the case? Baltimore's even worse?
Well, according to the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is called the nation's report card, this is federal data that we can look at.
Right.
Baltimore is about the second or third lowest performing school system in the country. The other ones, according to the federal government, being Detroit, Cleveland, Milwaukee, and Baltimore are generally the 4 lowest. And that is really what Failure Factory is all about. So I've been investigating Baltimore City schools for the past 8 years. And we first started looking into this because none of the data, Larry, none of it made any sense. So back in 2017, when this book first starts, we could see using federal data that Baltimore was one of the highest funded large school systems in America. But at the same time, using federal data, we could see it was one of the lowest performing large school systems in America. So how does that happen? How do you get one of the highest funded school system almost every year that is also almost every year one of the lowest performing? And that was really the question that we were trying to answer 8 years ago. And the reason that I wrote this book, the reason I wrote the book Failure Factory, is because I now know the answer. And the answer is because the school system's priority is funding. That's the number one thing that they're concerned about. The second thing that they're concerned about is using that funding to hire adults. And everything comes after that. Excuse me, everything comes after that. And just let me give you some data here that can prove this point. In 2024, which was the most recent year for which we have data, 10% of Baltimore students tested proficient in math. In the entire city, 10% of kids tested proficient in math. That means 90% of the kids in Baltimore are not proficient in math, but yet it had a 72% graduation rate. Well, how are you graduating 72% of your kids, but only 10% of your kids are proficient in math? And the answer is because Education is not the priority. Funding is the priority. That's what we're seeing in Baltimore City schools. That's what we're seeing spread out into the suburbs. And that's what we're really seeing spread out across the entire country. I've spent 8 years of my life, every single professional working day of my life doing this. And the book has come to that conclusion, that that is where we are in America. There's so much money now in public education. That is the priority, not the students.
Chris, I think it's long been proven that there's no real relationship between how much money they spend and the quality of the education. You can look at how much money they spend in New York, in D.C., I'm in Los Angeles, and Chris, in California. The amount of money they spend on education is tethered to the budget. And every time the budget gets bigger, the schools get a raise. But there's no question that that raise has not translated into better performance. We only have 2 minutes left in this segment. I want you to stick around a little while longer if you can. Where is the outrage? Are the parents getting pitchforks and marching on the Capitol of Maryland? Are the teachers, at least some of them, concerned about what's going on? Where's the outrage?
There isn't any. And that's why I wrote this book, because the outrage is with you. The outrage is with people like myself. The outrage seems to be people outside of Baltimore and the people outside of Maryland that are looking at this data, and they're saying, how is this acceptable? How is it acceptable that you spend $1.7 billion a year and 10% of your kids can pass a state math test and be proficient? Now, if you look at Baltimore, there is not one elected Republican in the entire state of Maryland that represents Baltimore. Whether you look at the 2 U.S. senators in Baltimore, you look at the U.S. House of Representative members, you look at the governor, the attorney general, the comptroller, the treasurer, you look at all the state senators, all the state house members, the mayor, city council, all the way down. The only elected Republican in America that has jurisdiction over Baltimore is Donald Trump. There's nobody else.
The book is called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. My guest is Chris Papst. Chris, we're going to take a break. We'll be right back. 888-971-SAGE. Do not leave town. Triple 8-971-SAGE, 888-971-7243. Larry Elder, Salem News Channel. The book is called Failure Factory: How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future. And if you look at the cover, you see a child holding up a little poster that says, I am a produce of Baltimore City School, 2 exclamation points, by my guest, Chris Papst. Chris, I suppose it's intentional that you misspelled produce. A kid misspelled produce on the cover on your sign to the product.
Well, he also spelled school wrong.
Yeah,
school is spelled incorrectly.
Yes.
Yeah.
Incredible.
That's a real picture, by the way. That was at a protest. That's a real picture. That's a real thing.
Chris, let's go back to outrage. What's been the reaction to your book?
Well, again, it's very similar to what we were talking about before. Within the city, it's been ignored. I was talking about how there are no elected Republicans in Maryland that have any jurisdiction over Baltimore. And what that really has led to is that you have one party rule and there's nobody willing to go against that party, because the Baltimore City school system is 100% created and run by one political party. And no one's willing to come out against that. And I released this book a couple weeks ago, Failure Factory. It's a bestseller on Amazon. It's doing really well because it's alarming. The data that we just talked about, Larry, is alarming. 90% of the kids in the city with a $1.7 billion budget are not proficient in math, but there's nobody, and I mean nobody, no elected officials in this city that are screaming that this is not okay. It is just accepted.
Chris, there have to be parents who are aware of this and who want out of the Baltimore public school system. For that parent, is there an out? Do you have school choice?
No. So Maryland has very, very, very few options when it comes to school choice. There is the Boost program, but Governor Wes Moore, who went to a private school, by the way, is cutting that back. And the education that he has said served him so well, he is not affording people in Maryland that same right. The Boost program, which is our voucher system, is being cut down to the point where it's going to be eliminated in the next few years. So students really don't have much of a choice here. And Baltimore is a city with 20 to 25% poverty. The people who live here don't have the means to be able to afford private school of their own or get out of the city. And the last thing I can say about that is that, for 8 years that I've been doing Failure Factory and writing this book, every single parent I talk to wants better for their kids. But many of those parents were also undereducated by the same school system that's currently undereducating their children. And they don't have, and this is not an insulting comment, it's true. They don't have the means to be able to fight this school system. They can't fight a $1.7 billion bureaucracy with massive attorneys. They simply can't do it. And they're beaten down, they're frustrated, they feel like they have no power. And unfortunately, the only power they have is to call someone like me in the media who can put them on TV and tell their stories and write a book like Failure Factory to try to hold the school systems accountable to say, no, you have to do better.
Chris, some years ago, a think tank called the Fordham Institute asked urban public school teachers with school-age kids where they sent their own kids. Nationwide, about 10% of families have their kids in private school. Around 6% of black families have their kids in private school. But 49% of Philadelphia public school teachers with school-age kids put their own kids in private schools. In other words, the people that knew the school system the best, the teachers, weren't putting their own kids in it. My question is, where are Baltimore public school teachers with school-age kids sending their own kids?
That's not public data, but anecdotally, I can tell you that I would say well over half of the Baltimore City employees likely don't live in Baltimore City. There are many people that are in the C-suite in Baltimore City Public Schools, the chief executive suites. They oftentimes send their kids to private school. So I think what you mentioned in 2 segments ago before you had me on, I think you're seeing very similar things here in Baltimore City as well. And it makes sense if you look at the numbers that we just talked about. These schools are simply not providing a good education to most of the students in this city.
We come back, I want to ask you, what do we do about this, Chris? It's one thing to identify the problem, it's another thing to do something about it. Years ago, I interviewed Kwesi Mfume, who at the time was the president of the NAACP. As you know, he's a congressperson from the Baltimore area now. He was before then, went to the NAACP and then went back to politics. And I said, Mr. Mfume, as between the presence of white racism or the absence of black fathers, which poses a bigger problem to the black community? To his credit, without missing a beat, Chris, he said the absence of black fathers. I want to ask you, too, about whether or not that plays a role here in this crisis that we're talking about. 888-971-SAGE, 888-971-7243. What do we do about this? My guest, again, is Chris Papst. The book is called Failure Factory, How Baltimore City Public Schools Deprive Taxpayers and Students of a Future.